Good morning, welcome and thank you very much for joining us on our webinar this morning. My name is Katie Burley. I'm one of the associates in the employment team here at FSP, and you can hopefully see my colleague Jackie Denham as well. He's also one of the senior associates in the employment team, and we're going to be talking you through today various different aspects of returning to the workplace post-COVID. We do have a huge amount to get through today. It's quite wide topics that we've challenged ourselves to cover. As you will know, we've got a couple of housekeeping points to start you off with. As you can obviously tell, this is going to be this is a remote seminar. You are obviously wherever you are, and we are here. So please do bear with us if we have any technical issues as we go through. We will try to rectify them as swiftly as possible. The webinar should be around an hour long, and we will really try and keep to that if we can. As I say, there's a lot to cover, but you are all on mute. If you would like to ask any questions as we go through, there is a question box, so you can pop those in there, and we will do our very best to answer some of those at the end of the session if there is time, fingers crossed. If you would like a copy of the slides, you can download these. There is a handout section, so if you want to pop into there, you can do that during the course as long as the webinar is live, and you'll be able to download those and keep those for future reference if you would like. The webinar is actually going to be recorded. It will be emailed out to you all being well later on today. So if if the Amazon man knocks at the door, normally the case in my world, when you need to go and answer it, you missed something that we've said, please feel free. You can watch it again later and catch up. Now, the last thing I would say is that we would love to get your feedback. At the end of the webinar, when it closes, there will be a feedback form that will pop up on your screens. If you'd like to fill that out, we would be very, very grateful. We do try to filter that into future webinars and seminars. There is a chance to win a £50 John Lewis voucher if you do so. There's a little bit of an incentive there to hang on to the end if you would like. That would be much appreciated. Now, just another small point I'll just mention. Now, obviously, while the UK government has called for a coordinated approach on the latest sort of lifting of lockdown measures, there have been various differences, as I'm sure we're all quite aware, amongst the devolved nations during the time. Now, because we are based in England, we'll be focusing predominantly on the English regulations and what's applicable in England at the moment. That said, obviously, there could be circumstances where things might be slightly different outside of that. I think most of what we're covering won't be, but just something just to flag you, just so that you're aware. Okay, right. Well, we will launch into it. As I say, we've got a lot to cover today. So I'm going to be covering testing and vaccinations. That's going to be the first part. Then I will pass over to Jackie later on, and she will cover lots of other interesting things that I'm sure you'll be keen to hear about. So just to make sure you're actually all listening and there's actually somebody there, and I'm not just talking to myself because I can't obviously see any of you today, which is very strange. We're going to start with a poll today. So there'll be a couple of polls throughout the course of the presentation. If you would get involved, we'd absolutely love that. So hopefully that's going to pop up on your screens now, and we are going to have a poll. So ask you, so the question is, as you can hopefully see now, do you intend to ask staff to be regularly tested for COVID-19 upon their return to the workplace? Few different options there. So will it be mandatory, will it be optional? You're not sure actually how to go about it. Hopefully, if that's the case, we can help with that today. You're not looking at all or not sure yet. So I'll give you a couple of moments just to quickly answer that. Hopefully it's a reasonably straightforward question to start you off with. Get you all into your screens if you're still wandering around making a cup of tea in the background. I'll give you a couple more moments. Hopefully there will be some participation. So here we go. Right. So vast majority, I'm not sure yet, and well, hopefully we can help you with that today. Yes, optional testing, again, that's quite a popular one. A few of you, 7%, are saying it'll be mandatory. So yeah, okay, that's quite interesting, and that will hopefully say we can help with that going forward. So let's actually start talking about it and go back to the main slides. So just wait for the slides to catch up. Just bear with me. We might be having a little bit of a wobble with the slides. So oh, here we go. Right. As most of you are probably aware, workplace testing is encouraged by the government, but at the moment there's no legal requirement to actually do this. Now, there are two particular types of tests I'm going to focus on today, and those are the lateral flow and the PCR tests. I'm not really going to be looking at antibody tests, really, because at the moment there's no clear evidence regarding whether somebody who's actually had COVID-19 and their future immunity. That's certainly, it's not particularly clear at the moment, so it's not necessarily going to be as relevant for workforce testing as other methods. Now, currently, everybody in England is able to access free lateral flow tests. This has actually opened up potential for workforce testing massively. It's much easier, it's much quicker, and there's a lot more sort of admin to think about on that respect. Now, as I've said, it is a voluntary decision of whether you want to run a testing process with your staff. Employers have been quite actively encouraged to sign up and regularly test their employees to help reduce the risk of transmission amongst those who cannot work from home. Now, obviously, at the moment, the current state of play is that the stay-at-home order has been lifted. That said, the work from home where possible order is still there. So I'm sure that you've probably got lots of people still at home. That's obviously why you're here today. So for those people who aren't coming in, it could be a consideration. So if you want to embark upon a testing process, one of the questions I think a lot of people think is, well, how am I going to go about it, and what will my employees say? What are they going to say? So let's look at some of the good bits, the good messages that you can get across to people. So this getting people tested can obviously mitigate the risk of transmission amongst your workplace. You can find out whether somebody has COVID. You can pinpoint isolated cases early on and help avoid a spread. You're obviously looking at asymptomatic individuals. Now, given that it's been said that about around 1 in 3 people who have coronavirus don't have symptoms, and obviously could therefore be spreading it without knowing, you're able to hopefully identify those and again, help reduce transmission amongst your workforce. One thing that is actually quite useful is whether it can build confidence amongst staff and customers. If you've got people who feel quite anxious about coming back into the workplace, this could be something that might help. And obviously, the thing that we all want, we want to support business continuity. That could well be something that could be helped by having a testing process in place. Now, while there are ups and there are positives, there are always downsides, and there are a number of less appealing bits, which is on the next slide. So isolation requirements, I think we all are hopefully aware of those. So I'm not going to go into them, but they are there, they will apply depending on the outcome of any tests that you undertake. There are a number of legal issues. As with most things when it comes to dealing with employees, there's always legal issues. So whilst you might actually have pretty understandable health and safety reasons for wanting to test your employees, the employees themselves may actually not be on board with this, and that may well be some of your issues will come from. They may well see it as an unnecessary invasion of their privacy. The testing itself can obviously be a little bit uncomfortable, and they may feel it is unnecessarily invasive if there are other measures, social distancing and those sorts of things that you can actually put into place. So you're going to be looking really at whether this is a proportionate way of addressing any health and safety risks in your workplace. The risk of claims being brought. Now, there are a couple of key types of claims that we can tend to be at risk of if putting into place a testing policy. The first one is constructive unfair dismissal. So that's when your employees resign as a result of something that you have done or are planning on doing. They could well feel that it is invasive, that it's an uncomfortable process, that it's unjustified, that there's a potential impact on their private life, if they have to isolate when they haven't got symptoms and those sorts of things. So there's potential there. The other angle that's quite commonly a risk is discrimination, if there's some sort of linked or protected characteristic. What I will say on this front is that if you do decide to carry out any form of testing on your employees, I'd really recommend that you make sure it's very consistent, and we like consistency in employment. We like to treat everybody the same, and it's sort of, it helps avoid these kinds of issues. If you did decide for some reason to test only certain groups that you felt were potentially more at risk of having coronavirus, that could potentially quite easily lead to discrimination. So if there's a person category that you think may have been out and about partying and socialising and not social distancing, it wouldn't be right just to test those. You will need to be consistent. Data protection issues, definitely a less appealing bit. There's not enough time to go into data protection. It does come up quite a lot, and I will mention it and sort of flag it to you throughout the course of today. But the one thing I will say is that obviously anything that you are gathering is likely to be special category data, and you're going to need to process it accordingly. There are lots of hoops that you need to jump through. There's lots of justification that you need to find. You need to find a legal basis for processing that data. You need to think about how you're going to deal with it, etc., etc. So it's an entire seminar in itself, that one, but just important to flag it. And the final thing I'll mention on the other bits is actually, even if you get testing into place, it's not going to negate your obligation to actually do your usual other safety measures. So the things that we've currently got in place, let's say the distancing, the masks, all of that sort of stuff, that will need to continue. So don't think that it's going to be a simple way out of difficulties that we've got in workplaces as it is. Right, so on to the next slide then. Going to be looking at some sort of initial considerations and things to think about. Now, ACAS, good old ACAS, they like to come up with some guidance. They have certainly done so. They have produced some lovely guidance called Working Safely During Coronavirus, which actually helpfully includes a section on testing that we can refer to. I think, as we all know, usually if ACAS writes something, it's sensible to read about it and quite often to comply with it. Certainly when it comes to other certain things, and this is no exception. It's a good one to look at. Interestingly, ACAS's approach is that it's actually emphasising in the guidance that there is no legal requirement as of yet to compel staff to be tested. And it actually says that in most situations it's probably not going to be necessary, which is quite interesting. That says it does recognise the fact that there will be businesses who will want to undertake it and or feel that they need to undertake it. So they have given some guidance, and I'd recommend that people have a look at that. If you are thinking about going about implementing a testing program, there's some things I'd probably suggest you think about at the initial stages, and I've listed those on this slide. So first things first, is it going to be voluntary or is it going to be compulsory? You know, how are you actually going to do it? When doing this, you're going to be wanting to think about the risks in your specific workplace, because there's not one blanket approach for this, unfortunately. It is going to be very particular to what you do, how your setup is and everything else. If you decide to go ahead with it, it does need to be a proportionate and appropriate response to the risks that you have. You'll need to be able to justify that approach, not only to yourself, but also to your employees. I'm sure they want to know why you're putting it in place. It could be, I know I've just vouched on about consistency, but it could well be that actually some teams will have different approaches to others. But again, you know, that there are things that you will need to think about to make sure that it's appropriate and proportionate for the relevant people. As I've already mentioned, you can't force people to have tests at the moment. It is voluntary. If there are other things that you can do to actually keep workforce risks at bay, for example, you know, the distancing and the other things that we already know about, it could actually be that that is going to be a more appropriate way of dealing with things, and you may well struggle to prevent people who have not had a negative test result from actually coming into your workforce. So it might be quite difficult actually to really implement that. Once you've decided on how you're going to approach it, have a think about what type of test you're going to use. Obviously, the two different types of tests have different ways and means of going about them. The lateral flow seems to be the most common because it's quite quick, but again, make a decision on that basis. How often to test? Quite commonly, people are testing twice a week, but you can make up your own decision on that based on the risks and how often people are coming into the workplace, etc. The one that I will focus a little bit more on, I'm conscious that I'm whizzing through this quite quickly, but the one that is actually very important is actually really thinking through how it's going to work. You know, where are you going to test these people? So if you're having them in the office, what's the process? Are they going to come in? Are they going to be filtering off to a side office? Are they going to take the test? They're going to be moved to a waiting room while they're waiting for the results. What are you going to do with them during that time? Now, obviously, it would seem a little bit strange if they're to take their test and then to go and sit at their desk as normal and wait their results. And if they're mingling with other people during that time, again, that could be a decision that you take, and that's absolutely fine. There are things along the lines of how they need to be paid for that time while they're waiting for the test. If you're thinking, well, we'll get them to do it at home and then come in afterwards once they've got a negative result, again, what's going to happen? You know, is that going to be deemed working time? Will you be paying for that? Will you be happy for them to come in later after they've had their results? You know, lots and lots of things on that level that you're going to need to think through quite carefully. Who are you going to test? So we're working on the basis of employees today, but there are people such as contractors potentially on your site. There are visitors, just generally, you know, in our situation, we have clients. You know, are we going to be looking at testing clients and everybody else? Things like that need to be thought about as well, because what you don't want to do is only test a certain category of people and then undermine it by letting other people run riot within your workplace. Something to think about there. And the final thing, and this is something that ACAS really actively encourages, is thinking about how you're going to support people that do actually test positive. Now, there is the practical side of well, if you've got someone in the office and they've tested positive, how are you going to make sure they safely get home and go off and have their PCR test? That aside, ACAS is really suggesting that actually one of the main reasons why people are quite hesitant about having tests, apart from the uncomfortable side of things, is actually that they're a bit worried about the knock-on effect, either on their pay or just their treatment within the workplace if they do have a positive test result. There are a few things that they're suggesting that we can try and do to help with that and to comfort and support employees with that. One of them is making sure that staff are paid their usual rate of pay. if they do need to take time off work. And the other one is actually in relation to the sickness absence itself. So not counting sickness absences related, on the back of a positive test as either part of their sickness record, or indeed not using it towards those sort of HR trigger points that sometimes will have disciplinaries and those sorts of things. So a little bit of reassurance may well help with your uptake. Right, on the next slide, I will go through a couple of points about actual implementation when you're at that stage. So one of the first things that you're going to want to think about is the basis on which you're actually going to be able to enforce people, or strongly encourage people, should we perhaps say, to actually come on board with your approach to testing. Now, there's a few things that have been floated about how this could be done. The first one I've listed there is about reasonable management instructions. This is a slightly tricky one. So there has been questions about whether an employer could actually attempt to rely on the request being a reasonable management instruction under sort of some guise of intending to protect health and safety within the workforce. That said, given the fact that what you're actually asking people to do, it's quite an invasive test, and the fact that probably for most people it's actually going to be unrelated to their actual day-to-day duties, I wouldn't suggest it's going to be a watertight approach. I'd suggest you're probably going to struggle with that one. There could be circumstances for particular industries, but for most of us, that's not going to be enough completely to be able to compel people. The second thing that people are sort of wondering about is whether it can be a contractual or policy requirement. Now, again, potentially tricky. Obviously, if you do have a policy, which I'm sure most people do, you can put in your testing measures into that, as and when you're rolling it out and you're updating it, you can certainly put that in. Contractual things, sometimes they can be health clauses in your contract. Again, they'd have to be really wide to actually cover this, to be able to compel somebody to have a test. There's questions about whether we can put in alternative clauses into new recruits. Again, there's lots of issues coming back to the discrimination points and those sorts of things. It's going to be a little bit tricky, I'd suggest. To be honest, the most likely scenario for the majority of people is going to be getting people on board and getting them to agree. I've written on there, consult, talk to your employees, talk to your trade reps. If you've got trade unions, talk to them, try and get people on board, get them to support the mission and what it is that you're trying to achieve. That's going to be really the best way that you can go about it for the vast majority of people. Some people actually may feel it's going to be, they're really on board with it, that it's going to be much safer, they're happy with it. Others people may be, quite more reluctant and feel that there's other things that you can be doing. So the more you talk to people, the more you gauge what they're thinking, it can really help to actually filter into what you're planning on doing. ACAS, again, good old ACAS, they really heavily rely on this sort of idea of reaching agreement with staff. In their guidance, they've got a lot of information about the kinds of things that they suggest that you talk to people about. I'm not going to go through it now because we just don't have time, but again, if this is something you're thinking about, do refer to that guidance, have a look and see what they say. There's some helpful suggestions in there about the types of discussions that you can have. If you decide to go ahead, before you actually implement any testing, do make sure you tell your staff about it, inform them, make sure they're up to speed with this, all the different elements of how it's going to work and what you're going to do, and there's data protection stuff as well, which I'll come to in just a second. But as far as documentation goes, we always suggest that you record everything that you do as you go along as far as possible when it comes to employees, especially with big important decisions like this. Do make sure that you document the reasons why you're doing this, justification, all of those sorts of things. We'd really, really strongly recommend that you have a workforce policy in place. Make sure it's well drafted, make sure it's clear, make sure it covers all the things it needs to cover, which, as you probably gauge from what I'm saying, there's a lot of things that you need to cover. Make sure it ties in, for example, with your disciplinary and grievance policies if that's necessary. So it's all joined up, but that's something that we'd really strongly recommend. As far as the data protection goes, there you will, unfortunately, you probably need to update your privacy notices if you're going to, I feel like groans remotely, but that is something that you'll probably need to do. You'll need to prepare a specific testing policy, and that will cover all sorts of things. As I say, what information is collected, how long it's going to be retained for, who's going to have access to it, all of these sorts of things. It's absolutely imperative that your staff are aware of that if you're going to put this into place. Now, obvious point, regular review, things are changing all the time. It could well change by the end of the day. I don't think it will at the moment, but there are lots of changes. This is a moving feast. You're going to need to review the latest legislation, the guidance, and make sure that you keep up to date and make any tweaks to your policies that you need to, depending on how things go. And the final thing I'm just going to say on testing, problems. There is always scope for problems when it comes to implementing something like this that people are going to have quite strong feelings about. I thought of so many today and we just don't have time to go through them. It could be, again, another seminar in itself, so apologies for that. But quite a common one is, what if you put in a policy and someone refusing to comply? Is it going to be a disciplinary matter? My suggestion would be, well, for that sort of thing, probably take some advice, because it is going to be tricky, and there are, as we said, risks of claim potential, that sort of thing. That said, yeah, I think that's probably the most I can say on that front. But I will move on to vaccines now, because this is obviously something that's very topical, and we're getting a lot of questions about this. Vaccinations, at the moment, we all know it's going really well. It's in the UK, it's being rolled out very quickly. We're looking good. Hopefully by the end of the year we'll be looking even better. So it's going in the right direction. Fingers crossed, touch lots of wood. At the moment, obviously, it's not mandatory for any sectors to be vaccinated. It is something that is being looked at, certainly in the social care sector, those sorts of things, and the government are reviewing whether that could be something that will come about. But at the moment, it's not. Nobody, it's not mandatory for anybody at all to have a vaccine. To be honest, the government, as I said there, there is no current legislative power to actually mandate a COVID-19 vaccine. If the government can't do it, nobody else can at the moment. They've got potential, they've got rules to make regulations and put restrictions potentially on unvaccinated people moving about. Likewise, other countries may well prevent people from travelling in. So if you've got employees that travel, there could be scope for other things. But at the moment, as I say, no legislative power, nobody can be forced. Very, very briefly, I'll just touch on the COVID status certification review. I'm sure you've heard about this in the news, the passports, vaccine passports, that sort of thing. It is under review. It's definitely something to keep your eye on. It could well make things quite different as far as how we're going to use vaccination and the changes of what you can do within your workforce. But at the moment, we don't know. They're suggesting that it should come out before the end of next month. So do watch this space. Right, okay, so moving on to the next slide, important stuff, so things that we actually do know about. One of the things that I certainly do know about is that we're getting a lot of questions from people asking about whether we can actually require employees to be vaccinated at all. And secondly, whether people can prevent unvaccinated employees from actually entering the workplace. Now, there's a huge amount of questions, as you can imagine, when it comes to dealing with these sorts of things. Some of them are sort of similar to the testing things, but I will go through them and hopefully shed some light on these two rather important questions. Now, about the first one, as I said on the slide, the Equality Human Rights Commission actually warned back in April that any form of sort of blanket, mandatory, completely inflexible policies are pretty likely to be unlawful, and that certainly seems to be the case. As I sort of just hinted at, if the government can't force people to have, they can't legislate it, it seems pretty unlikely that employers would as well. And there's lots of different reasons why actually it wouldn't necessarily be wise to do that or try and do that within your workforce at the moment. ACAS, again, they've got guidance on vaccines as well, happy days. So they are actually encouraging people to sort of really support their staff about making a vaccination sort of decision and to go forth and have the vaccination rather than actually trying to compel them to. So I will look at some suggestions of how you can actually do that later. On the next slide then, so we've got some questions about things to consider if you are actually looking at implementing a policy, and key considerations. Now, the first thing to really think about when you're thinking, oh, can I keep those people out, those unvaccinated ones out? Is that actually going to be practical for your workplace? And I think that's the suggestion you really need to have a proper think about. Is it actually practical? To be honest, at the moment, I'd suggest it's probably not. There are a great number of people that haven't even had their invitation to have their first vaccination yet. So you're going to be excluding quite a chunk of your workforce if you're looking to keep people out. That could well change. Come the end of the year, we may well be in a different position, but for the time being, it's unlikely to be practical to completely exclude people. Practicalities aside, well, there is obviously the point that at the moment, the guidance is very, very clear that the vaccination status of your workforce has absolutely no impact whatsoever on your need to follow the COVID secure guidelines. You've got to continue following them. Even if people have been vaccinated, they've got to wear masks, they've got to wash their hands, they've got to socially distance, all of that kind of stuff. and as a little side point, I'll drop this in because it's certainly something that I have noticed, is if you do have any employees who are whipping off their masks and saying, oh, I've had my second jab, I don't need to wear this anymore, you do, and you are under an obligation to make sure that all those measures still need to be upheld despite the vaccination process. So as I say, on a practical level, is it really going to be worth it? If you're looking at actually going ahead and having some form of vaccination policy, you're going to need to think about what grounds you're doing, what's your basis, because I'm sure employees will ask, and likewise actually you may well get people asking you why you aren't doing it, and you'll want to explain the reasons why you're not. So your grounds, certain things that you can think about. Now obviously employers do owe a duty of care to protect the health and safety of employees, and obviously those who are affected by their business. But even with that, you're reasonably unlikely to be able to justify mandatory vaccination for obvious reasons, as I've already said. There is the point as well to bear in mind about the fact that although vaccination obviously greatly reduces the risk of you or the vaccinated person contracting COVID, we don't actually know about the risk of transmission and the fact that whether they can still carry it and they can still pass it on. That is still very much under review. Fingers crossed it'll be good news when the results come out of that, but at the moment we don't know, so we do need to still be careful. We don't know how long vaccination immunity will last. There's lots and lots of questions about that mean that actually at the moment necessarily looking to exclude people just because they haven't had a vaccine is not necessarily going to be the best course of action. Again, is it a reasonable management request? Probably going to be tricky for similar reasons that we discussed before. If you really need to look at it, look at the roles in quite good detail, look at the risks, look at if there's anything else that you can do. A really, really key point is that vaccination is actually not going to be suitable for everybody, and that has been quite clearly demonstrated and publicised. There are people, for example, with immune deficiency issues. There will be people who have allergic reactions to things. There are people who have long COVID who've been potentially told they need to defer vaccination. There are lots of people who actually cannot have the vaccine, not even out of choice, but for a very good reason. So it's not suitable for everyone. So you will be excluding certain categories of people by having any sort of regulations within your workforce. On to the next slide then, and looking at legal risks. I mean, a lot of these are legal risks anyway, but the sort of more clear ones when we talk about claims and things. There's potential risk of repudiation, breach of contract, and looking at constructive dismissal claims. It's been almost very clearly publicised about the potential breaches of Articles 8 and 9 of the ECHR. And that would be an issue. Discrimination claims is probably the biggest one that you'd all need to be aware about. I've listed loads. There are so many that this actually covers, and I'd love to have the time to go into them all in great detail. But a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory, I would suggest. So age, obviously we're looking at the age limits of who's actually being vaccinated as we go along. The younger categories, they're not there yet. And also there's an argument to say that actually the younger people may well not want to have vaccines because they don't feel they're as high risk and those sorts of things. Disability, I've mentioned some of those already. Pregnancy, maternity is actually quite an interesting one. Now, obviously, the guidance has swayed quite widely for pregnant individuals. Initially, it was that they couldn't have the vaccine, and now they're saying they can, but that has caused a lot of concern, and a lot of people are obviously quite naturally reluctant to have the vaccine whilst they are still pregnant or planning on being pregnant. And while on the subject of planning on being pregnant, there is a related potential for risk of a sex discrimination claim from women of a childbearing age who are actually being shown, interestingly, they are one of the highest categories of people who will reject a vaccine on the basis of a concern about potential effect on fertility and those sorts of things. Race, I think we've probably all heard the information in the news about minorities being less likely or sort of having more of a hesitancy to come aboard with a vaccine program. Religion and belief, also it's lots of things under that. And anti-vaxxers, I will mention very quickly. Now, anti-vaxxers are less, well, it's at the moment it's seeming pretty unlikely that they will actually meet the bar to come forward with discrimination claims, but they are potentially some people that you will come across and you may well have difficulties in obviously convincing to have a vaccine because they don't believe in it or they think it's a bad idea. So lots and lots of different people that you may well have difficulties with. Very quickly, just on negative publicity, if you are enforcing something, it could have a negative impact on how your business is perceived by others. Likewise on recruitment and retention, those sorts of things might not be great for your business. Data protection implications, I've already mentioned them, I'm not going to go into it again, but please do bear that in mind. And consultation, we'd highly recommend, obviously you're going to need to consult with people, it's going to be an important part of any process as you go through. Now, the final bit that I'm going to go through on the last slide is obviously these alternatives, so things that you can think about doing in the alternative, actually, preventing people from coming into your workplace. And what I'd be suggesting that you do is really sort of focusing on how best to achieve voluntary vaccination within your workplace. That's going to be the best way forward, and it's certainly the thing that seems to be well supported by different bodies, and looking at alternatives that you can actually bring about. So I think if the last slide will appear in a moment, you can follow me through, but I'll carry on while we're waiting for it to catch up. So one of the first things I suggest you do, consult with your workforce again. Speak to them, see if you can get them on board, see what questions, what concerns they have, what can help them in coming through to coming on board with actually getting vaccines. Oh, sorry, I apologise, and the slides are jumping around a little bit, so I'm sure it will just go back in just a moment and hop back to the previous slide. There we go. Yes, so sensitive internal communications, that's certainly something that you can actually think about doing. So you are entitled to be able to contact your workforce, let them know about negatives, positives about having the vaccine, so that they can make an informed decision rather than maybe something they've read on social media. There's all sorts of issues that could come about with that. A lot of businesses have actually suggested they feel a little bit uncomfortable in doing that, but it certainly is something that you are able to do if you wish. Sensible alternatives is really something that has been encouraged, as I said, by ACAS in particular. So looking at things such as ways to incentivize employees. I'm not talking about giving them a bonus if they've got it, but more things along the lines of paid time off to go and actually have their vaccine is probably quite a good incentive if they don't have time outside working hours because they've got childcare responsibility, whatever it might be. Equally, if they do have any side effects of the vaccine, you could offer them paid sick pay. That may well help to increase your uptake. Outside of that, just go back to the basics, looking at other things that you can do outside of actually having people vaccinated to help. So there are, what measures have you got or should you have in your workplace and in your industry that are appropriate? There are a lot of businesses, I think, that have had people coming in and out during the previous lockdowns that maybe got a little bit too relaxed. And when you've got people that haven't been in the office or in the workplace, they may well be slightly more cautious of going into somewhere where people actually are throwing caution to the wind and doing what they want. Revisit things, go back, have a look at stage one and start that again. And the final thing, which actually will lead quite nicely on to what Jackie's going to be looking at, I'm conscious I'm eating up into her time, so I better hurry up and finish, is looking at things like working from home. Do you need to have people back into the office straight away? If people haven't been able to be vaccinated, can they continue to work from home until it's a safer time? And on that note, I will stop talking and I will pass over to Jackie, who will take you through lots of other things. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about health and welfare, which is obviously quite a key thing for your staff and employees. So the next slide is, I'm going to start again with another poll just to make sure you're all still listening. And this is a good one for me to understand, I guess, what you think your staff are thinking about at the minute. So what do you believe your employees are most worried about when they're thinking about returning to the workplace? You can select all that apply here. If you think there's more than one, please do select more than one. How safe is it to return? Are they worried about the coronavirus risks? Or are they worried about maybe a negative impact on productivity or their ability to concentrate? Are they worried about a negative impact on their work-life balance now? Do they have concerns related to childcare or other caring responsibilities? Are they anxious about meeting new colleagues if they've started during lockdown, for example? I'll give you a little bit of time to select all that you want. There we go. Wow, so it's two ones that are coming out there big. It's obviously about safety, but also about work-life balance. And that's not a big surprise, I don't think. There's two very big conflicting things there, isn't there? People are concerned about COMPAP and people are concerned about how it's going to affect them in their life. So thinking about health and welfare then, obviously, yes, there will be individuals that have health and safety concerns, and you need to be worried about that a little bit, because obviously ultimately they could constitute protected disclosures for the purpose of whistleblowing protection. So I would suggest obviously making sure that you do take those concerns seriously, that they might need to be properly investigated. You might even want to take them slightly separately in a separate process to make sure that you've got the right people who are well aware of what your risk assessments look like and the steps you've taken internally in order to be able to address those concerns. But separate to that, employees are having a whole range of emotions. Some are really excited about coming back to the workplace, as well as being a little bit anxious maybe about the steps that are in place if they've not been in the workplace for so long. But others are worried about things like work-life balance, and not just how they're going to fit the commute into their day, but potentially how they're going to work that with other responsibilities that they might have. They might now have different caring responsibilities than when they were last in the other workplace. They might have different availability, for example, of childcare might not be as available as it was, or the hours might be different. Related obviously to the commute is additional costs now. So, you know, they've had potentially a whole year where they haven't had to incur travel costs or parking costs or anything else, and now that's going to be another impact. And you don't know until you ask what the financial burden is of coronavirus on that particular family. Others have concerns about productivity, and quite rightly. So I think the reality is you've got to now fit a commute into your working day, and you might find that people have been working at home, working longer hours than they would have done, and now they've got to also fit in a commute into that time as well. There will be an impact of productivity. But not only just on those individuals that have been at home, you might have individuals that have been in the workplace for whatever reason, and those people might be impacted by the sudden return of other people coming into their workspace, where they've been used to working, I guess, in a workspace on their own, and are now going to have a lot of people returning with a lot of catching up to do, and there will be an impact of productivity, and some people are concerned about that. Again, the key, as we've said on the other parts so far, is going to be communication, I think, here. So you need to make sure not only do people understand exactly what the rules are of the workplace before they come back in, so that they're comfortable about that, but also that they're compliant, and also that they understand that it will be monitored, and that you will be taking steps to ensure that people are compliant, because that will help with their confidence in returning too. You need to also give people a lot of notice about returning, so that there's no surprises. Don't assume that people are ready and able to come back the minute that you've decided that it's safe for them to do so, because there may be some tweaks that they need to make in terms of how they commute if the public transport isn't running exactly the same as it used to be, or if the hours of the childcare or the school hours are different than they used to be. They can manage that when they're working from home, but it might be a little bit difficult, harder for them if they're having to get a commute involved as well. And obviously consultation, we keep throwing consultation at you, but strictly speaking, you know, the government and health and safety regulators do expect you to be consulting with your employees or your employee reps or your trade union reps about health and safety matters, but it's also a benefit to you to do that, because it means that they're on board and you're listening to any concerns they've got, and any additional suggestions. You might not have thought of everything, and maybe they've got new ones that might really help in terms of helping everyone return to the workplace safely. You might need to think a little bit about reintegration even, and retraining for some individuals. If you've got some individuals that might have been on furlough for a long time, they might need some retraining in order to feel confident coming back into the workplace. Even for those that have continued to work from home fully throughout this whole period, they might need a bit of reintegration. If, for example, you've changed any particular policies or processes, it will be a good opportunity to run through those with those individuals when they return. And if you've got individuals that have started at your business during lockdown and have actually never even been to your workplace, they might need some time meeting people in face-to-face and some formal induction or some formal introductions at least to their colleagues when they return, to feel again confident and less anxious about doing so. I think one-to-ones are going to be absolutely essential, so that you can understand the particular situation for each individual. It's going to be so varied across individuals about what their worries are, what their experience has been during lockdown. You know, some might have been through incredibly difficult circumstances. You might be aware of them, or you might not. They might have suffered bereavements that you don't know about. They might have new caring responsibilities for vulnerable people that you're not aware of. Again, you've got this issue around potential caring availability, childcare availability that you need to know about. They might be really worried about the commute, depending on how they travel to work. That again, it's good to get to the bottom of. And all of that is worth knowing as early as possible, really, so that you can try and again help them mitigate those concerns, or at least be there to support them when they're returning, so that there's nothing underlying that's going to then erupt when it happens. Ultimately, if there's anyone who's particularly anxious or needs additional support, you may have to ultimately refer them to occupational health. But if you've got any other programs in place, for example, an employee assistance program, you might again want to take the opportunity to highlight that to employees, so that they know that what support is available for them. So moving on to the next slide then. So what are you going to do if someone actually takes that step to say, I'm not coming back, I refuse to return? What are you going to do? Well, ultimately, obviously, you were going to have quite a difficult decision, I think, as to whether you can allow that particular individual to continue to work from home, or if you're going to take steps to try and force them to come back, either with some kind of disciplinary action, or ultimately, even if you think it's appropriate, to dismiss someone if they refuse. But before you get there, I think it's important that we run through some of the potential risks that you need to be aware of when making those decisions. So there is a section of the Employment Rights Act that before the pandemic, actually, most people had no idea even existed. And I know that it wasn't something that we'd ever really had to deal with either, because in a normal workplace, it's unlikely you're going to have massive health and safety concerns in an office space. But believe me, now that it's kind of become at the forefront of many employees' knowledge. So Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act is an additional protection that's given to employees who reasonably believe that they are in serious and imminent danger which cannot be averted, and then they take appropriate steps to protect themselves or other people in response to that danger. And what it means is, if they can establish that protection, it means they're protected from suffering any detriment as a result of them trying to avoid that danger. So, for example, if someone goes to the extreme of saying, I'm not coming into the workplace because I believe it's so dangerous to me or other people, which would include their family, that they would, if you then treat them in a certain way that means that they suffer a detriment, they would be able to bring claims against the company as a result. Now, that's not just the detriments of the extreme, to say if they're dismissed, or if they or if you try to discipline them and give them a formal warning. It would actually be some of the other things that might just be an impact of them refusing to come to work. So if they suffer a change in pay or a reduction in pay, for example, if you decide, oh, okay, well, we'll have to furlough you then, and they would get a reduction in pay, that could potentially be seen as a detriment in response to them exercising their right to protection. Or if they lose the right to, be considered for a promotion, or if you have to change their role significantly to enable them to continue to work from home, all of those could be considered a detriment, so we need to be aware of it. The biggest risk is that if you end up dismissing someone, or they resign in response to your approach and claim constructive dismissal, they could potentially have an automatic unfair dismissal claim. And the two key issues with that is, one, that it's uncapped in terms of value from financial losses. Two, it's a day one right, so there's no minimum service requirement in order to be able to claim that. So it would apply across the board to all employees in this position. And the third thing is that if they bring that claim, they can actually also be awarded by a tribunal an additional injury to feelings award if they've suffered particular distress as a result. It's important, I think, to realise that these are actually high hurdles, though, so it does have to be a reasonable belief. It's not just a belief. The tribunal will decide. They will apply an objective test to decide whether it was reasonable for that individual to feel that they are in serious and imminent danger. And obviously, some of the things do tie into this. So if you've followed all of the government guidance and all of the health and safety regulators' guidance for your particular type of workplace, and you've shared that information with the individual, it's far less likely for that individual to have a reasonable belief that they're going to be in serious and imminent danger if they turn up at the workplace. So it does all tie in together, but it is worth being aware of it. So moving on then, it is worth noting, I should have said then, that at the minute that particular protection only applies to employees. It is being extended to the wider category of workers from the 31st of May, so quite soon. Separate to that then, even if they can't satisfy all those high hurdles of feeling protected in that particular piece of legislation, they may well raise their concerns with you in a way that means that they are then protected as whistleblowers for raising health and safety concerns, which would mean that any detriment they then suffer as a result of raising that would allow them to bring a whistleblowing claim. Now, if they can bring a whistleblowing claim, again, it's uncapped in terms of financial loss, but it also opens up 2 additional types of claim that they could seek in the current circumstances. So the first one is actually an injunction. So if you are considering dismissing someone because they're refusing to work, and they can say, oh, it's all actually because I raised whistleblowing concerns, they could try and get an injunction to prevent you from actually dismissing them. Secondly, even if the dismissal goes ahead, they could claim interim relief, which is a very powerful claim. If it's quite high hurdles again to actually win it, but in terms of the benefit to the individual, if they were successful, it would mean that for the whole period from lodging their claim and winning the interim relief, they would receive their same salary and benefits right up until the final hearing where the decision was made on their case. And even if at that point they then are unsuccessful with their claim, they do not have to repay those salary and benefits to the employer. So it's a powerful tool as an individual to bring as part of the claim, so something to be aware of. Obviously, if you've got individuals who are particularly vulnerable to coronavirus, or even others that aren't vulnerable but that are suffering from a mental health condition that has a long-term impact on them, for example, anxiety or depression, then again, they could potentially have a disability discrimination angle to any particular claim in terms of how we respond to any refusal to come in. That might be, again, a detriment claim, or it might be a failure to make reasonable adjustments if they believe that maybe working from home would be a reasonable adjustment for them. Ultimately, obviously, that you can't be tied as an employer. If you need someone to come in and do it, you should feel like you can do that. You're just going to have to, I guess, basically follow the process through with a lot of consultation and potentially with medical advice and support as well during that process. I'm not going to run through a disciplinary process with you now, but you need to be absolutely full on in terms of following all the ACAS recommendations in terms of following that disciplinary process through. But the key will be consultation with the individual to make sure that you fully understand their concerns and that you have thought very, very carefully about them, and whether you really genuinely believe that a disciplinary warning or even dismissal is the only appropriate outcome in that particular scenario, taking into account all of the background reasoning. Moving on then to just mitigation. Obviously, what you really want is people not to refuse to come to the workplace. That would be ideal. So in terms of doing that then, first of all, I would suggest you document, obviously, your risk assessments. You need to do that anyway for health and safety legislation, but you want to share those with employees. Okay, it's because you should be doing it again as part of your consultation on health and safety matters with employees or their reps or trade union reps. But just sharing that information with people so that they understand what steps you're taking, all the risks you've identified and how you're mitigating them, and how you're keeping those individuals safe when they do return to the workplace, is much less likely that they're going to refuse to come in. But even if you then end up in the horrible situation where they are refusing and they're claiming all this health and safety protection, it's going to be much harder for them to claim that it was a reasonable belief that they had, that they were in serious and imminent danger. It just makes that claim much, much harder to bring. Obviously, you then got the requirement to keep those risk assessments and the mitigation up to date as and when the government and the health and safety regulator change their guidance, which, as we know, is regularly. So unfortunately, you have to keep them up to date. Consultation and engagement, again, obviously we keep saying this one, but one-to-ones are going to be absolutely essential in terms of trying to calm people down. If you've got people who are particularly concerned, hear them out, make them feel like you are properly listening to all concerns they've got and trying to help them with them. Obviously, documenting reasoning behind your decisions. The reason why I've said that is because you've got these elements that we've talked about with some of these other claims, like the whistleblowing claim and the health and safety claim. if you can explain that the reason for any actions you take that might be considered a detriment and nothing to do with the fact that they've raised a health and safety concern, or that they've tried to protect their own, their own safety because they think they're in imminent danger, but are for another business reason, and you've got a lovely paper trail that supports that, that's going to, again, really, really help you defend any particular claims. Ultimately, obviously, you might need to get occupational health involved, or even just referring people to your employee assistance program if they just need a little bit of support. Any of that, obviously, get them involved before you make final decisions about refusing to work. And flexible working. So flexible working is probably one of the ways that you can think about trying to mitigate people's concerns. There might be some easy wins there. So if you can make an adjustment, for example, to allow someone to continue to work from home a bit, again, that might win you some brownie points. If you can allow someone to change their working hours slightly, which would allow them to commute to the workplace if they have to go on public transport when it's only off-peak periods or less busy periods, again, that might be an easy win for you to just try and alleviate anyone's concerns if they relate to the commute as opposed to the workplace. That moves me nicely on to flexible working, which I'm going to rattle through, but we're going to start off with a poll again, just to see how you think your employees are thinking about flexible working, or what you're trying to think of doing in the workplace. So, there we go. So post-pandemic, do you expect there will be a long-term change in the way in which staff work within your organisation? So firstly, no, you're going to return to normal ways of working as soon as you can. Or no, but you think you'll return gradually to your normal ways of working. Or yes, you think there will be a long-term change. You're going to try and find some kind of new normal, combining what you used to do with new, maybe some kind of hybrid working from home situation. Or yes, you think there'll be a whole change and you're thinking about embracing whole new ways, maybe full flexibility going forwards. You can only select one of these, by the way. Exactly what I thought would happen. Yes, so, speaking to other clients is exactly, and obviously the BBC have done a poll recently as well. It is very likely, I think, the majority of employers will be going for some kind of hybrid going forward. Wonderful. Well, look, I'm not going to go through the whole of flexible working, the statutory process with you. I haven't got time, but I think the reality is that individuals will be looking for this kind of move going forward. There is all sorts of types of flexible working though, so don't just be thinking that they're going to be asking for working from home. They may well be asking for, I don't know, compressed hours or amended working hours, again around maybe helping them commute off peak. They might want to work part-time. They might want some kind of core working hours arrangement where they have flexibility at either end of the day but some solid hours in the middle. The thing to remember though is that if you get a ton of flexible working requests in, you do only have to, obviously there's an employee relations side of things, but in terms of what you have to do under statute, you only have to consider requests that from individuals, employees who have been employed with you continuously for 26 weeks and make a request in writing and haven't made one in the last 12 months. So if you want to try and wheedle out some, you can. The other thing to bear in mind is that you are only 8 lawful grounds on which you can just decline a request. There will no doubt be pressure from you if someone's been working prolonged from home in a very effective manner in terms of coming up with a reasonable decision on those requests. But having said that, there will be no doubt reasons why you might decide that you can't accept all those requests. There will be some impact on quality or performance in certain scenarios. For example, if you've got someone who is responsible for doing supervision of junior staff or training, or again, someone who is a junior member of staff who needs to have supervision or will gain a huge amount of experience just overhearing people's conversations, for example, you have a really good reason there for saying, actually, no, this isn't going to work for us with you working from home continuously full time, because it will have an impact, we believe, on your quality or performance in the role. Similarly, if you've got customers or clients who want to turn up your business for face-to-face meetings, or even turn up unexpected and they need people there to be able to help those individuals when they do, again, you have a good reason there to decline a request because you need to meet customer demand. I think there obviously, I've put the risks there. The risks, obviously, you get compensation if you haven't followed the right process. Someone might resign and try and seek constructive dismissal if you've acted really unreasonably with your decision making. There could be a discrimination angle if they, for example, if they've got childcare responsibilities, they could try and claim sex discrimination if you don't consider the request properly. Again, there's a breach of contract potential claim there if they can try and argue that their workplace has actually changed during this last period as a permanent situation, and that will very much depend on how you communicated with them at the time that they made the changes. But I think all this is a much wider issue, actually. The reality is that employees, it's not just a legal issue. You need to be looking at the market. You need to be thinking about staff retention. You need to be thinking about the fact that actually the government are talking very much about potentially consulting on making flexible working the default. So there's a bigger, wider context you need to be making these decisions in. So the next slide. The key will just be being reasonable. Consider everything carefully, be consistent with the approach that you take. Think about whether trial periods are appropriate. Obviously, if someone's been working from home for a year, don't trial that. But if the other type of amendments, if they've asked for something slightly different, you can trial that as a way of showing that you're definitely taking it seriously and seeing if it will work for you. And if you get multiple and competing requests, think carefully about how you're going to prioritise them. You might want to prioritise them by risk, or you might want to prioritise them by just first in, for, decisions made first for the first one we receive. Other considerations, I think the reality is that there'll be things you've parked for a while. There's things that you should have probably dealt with at the time, but you thought it was too hard because you can't do it face to face. It might be that there's performance issues, but you can't gather the evidence well enough when someone's working remotely. There might even be disciplinaries where you thought, oh God, we can't do that until we're face to face because it's too sensitive. Those are going to be really risky in terms of taking really formal action, so get advice on them if you need to, but just be very careful about making sure you've got the evidence and that a tribunal can say there's no way you can consider it that serious if you've been parking it for the last few months, and take action as soon as you possibly can once you are back into that workplace. Think about your information and data protection issues. If you've got people who've got hard copy personal data or confidential data at home, you need to transport that into the office carefully, give them guidance about how you expect them to do that, and manage your underlying tensions. There will be lots of people with lots of different experiences that are going back into one workplace, and you need to manage that. If you've had someone who's been on furlough for a long time and someone who's been massively busy and they're now going to come together and talk about their experiences, you need to be conscious that that might end up in a slightly awkward situation. That kind of thing, just be wary of it. Again, these one-to-ones are going to be massively important in terms of trying to nip things in the bud before they escalate. And that's all I'm going to try and cover in the time. We've got a tiny little bit of time for questions. We're going to do our absolute best. What I will say is, please complete the feedback form when the time clicks off in order to be able to win this wonderful prize of £50. We have got, obviously, if you're not already signed up to our e-balls and our updates, please just let us know, and we'll happily sign you up for our monthly e-balls. We also do immigration ones now as well. There's a new set of podcasts we're launching soon. It's called Get It Right, our Get It Right series, which gives you some 20-minute snippets of key things to be thinking about in terms of things like performance, disciplinaries, GDPR. Our first one next week is going to be on how to avoid employment tribunals, so watch out for those. And let's try and rattle through a few questions, Katie.
I was actually just going to say, Jackie, I've had a look, and we do have a number of questions. I'm having a little bit of trouble in seeing them all properly, though. They're all coming up as very teeny tiny on my screen. So what I was going to suggest, bearing in mind we've only got 1 minute until we were meant to finish anyway, what we will do, and we will go through those after today, which I hope is okay, and we will ping you an email if we possibly can, with some tips and a brief response, if that's all right with you, Jackie.
Yeah, but no, that's if we can't read them, we'll find a way of reading them, and then we get a big printout of all the questions that have been submitted. So we'll make sure we get back to you guys and answer anything you've got. I do really hope that you found the session very, very useful. I'm sorry we've had to rattle through so much. If there's anything in the feedback that you think, oh, actually we'd really like an extended session on this particular subject, please just pop it into those comments, and we'll see what we can do in terms of providing more detail on certain things that might be useful to you. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Hope it goes successfully well.